Professor, former Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer is a senior lecturer at Princeton. Before joining Princeton faculty in 2006, Kurtzer had a 29-year career in the Foreign Service. Among his positions was from 1997 to 2001, U.S. Ambassador to Egypt, and from 2001 to 2005, U.S. Ambassador to Israel. He has co-authored many books, and you should look them up. And thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. If one of you buys a book, my numbers on Amazon go from 18 million to like 7. So it's quite important. I want to thank Esther for inviting me to speak, and of course, Sally Gottesman for opening her home, and all of you for coming. It's a challenging day because it's a day when we remember Yitzhak Rabin, and we ask the question, the what if, the counterfactual of history. What would have happened had Rabin not been assassinated? In our community, we also ask the question, how could it be that he was assassinated by someone from our community, which was an extraordinary problem in its own right. And so using this occasion to think about this becomes not only important to memorialize Yitzhak Rabin, but also maybe to learn some of the lessons that need to be learned from his life and from the implications of his assassination. Esther already gave you a Dvar Torah. I was going to give one too, but I won't. On the Shabbat after the assassination, I spoke in our synagogue in Kemp Mill in Silver Spring, Maryland, and talked about Yitzhak Avinu, an important figure in his own right, but also a transitional figure. And Rabin was the same. He was a product of Israel. He was born in Palestine, Israel. But in a way, he was the transition from the generation of Israel's founders to what now is our generations of those only born in Israel. And that becomes...
interrupt you to move a little, because I think the people with the chair, because the people are seeing too much blue. Sorry. Hopefully this is better.
Okay?
Yes, thank you.
So with that, what I want to do is share some thoughts, analytical thoughts about the implications of Rabin's assassination, looking back over the past 30 years. I want to start with a story. In February of 1993, Rabin had been in office for about 8 months, and he came on his first visit to the United States after the election of Bill Clinton, the previous November. Now, when prime ministers come to the United States, of course, they want to meet the president, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, members of Congress. And Rabin did all of that, but he also asked to meet with the US peace team. In other words, the individuals who were working with the Secretary of State and who had helped bring about the Madrid Peace Conference and continued to work on the peace process. It was one of the highlights of my own career to have been part of that peace team from the time that Secretary of State Baker started his shuttles until we brought about the Madrid Peace Conference and then beyond. And so when we heard that Rabin wanted to meet only with us, in other words, not with the Secretary of State present, we said it was very nice, and we thought he simply wanted to thank us for the work that we had put in, but it wasn't the case. Now, just a little bit of backdrop. After Madrid, which was late October, November 1991, both bilateral and multilateral negotiations took place, as you know. And the bilateral talks took place in Washington, Israel-Syria, Israel-Lebanon, Israel-Jordan, and Israel-Palestinians. The Israel-Jordan negotiations went swimmingly, and a couple of years later, they reached a peace treaty. The Israel-Syria negotiations actually proved to be quite interesting, and over the years, even though people thought that that was going to be the hardest set of negotiations, the two sides did quite well for some period of time. We can go into that in the Q&A if you wish. But the Israel-Palestine negotiations just stalled. They weren't going anywhere. So Rabin comes to Washington in February against the backdrop of an effort by Shimon Peres, who was his foreign minister, to begin to allow Israelis to talk to the PLO. Now, up until November of 1992, it was illegal for Israeli citizens to meet the PLO. And in November of 1992, the Knesset passed legislation that removed the illegality and made it possible. And the reason they did it was because Peres and his team had this idea that they wanted to establish a back channel to the PLO to see whether or not something could move forward in parallel with the formal negotiations that were taking place in Washington. Rabin knew about it. He was not happy about it, but he didn't stop it. In other words, he allowed this exploratory process to get off the ground. And in fact, in January of 1993 was the first meeting of what ultimately became known as the Oslo Channel. The Norwegians had decided early on that they wanted to be the broker. They didn't do much substantively, but they provided auspices and smoked salmon, and periodically they would be helpful. But this was very much a classic back channel, where at the beginning, PLO officials, but Israeli academics met in Oslo to start to figure out whether or not they could get together. So it wasn't truly a government-to-government back channel. And therefore, when Rabin came to Washington in that February, we were in this hybrid model. So he walks into the room where the peace team, and when I say team, you know, we just had the World Series, you had 9 guys on the field for each team. There were 5 of us who did the work for the Secretary of State. And we were waiting anxiously to hear what Rabin had to say. And he spent the entire hour in a soliloquy, in a kind of lecture in which he was thinking out loud, how do you deal with Palestinians who are not authorized by the PLO? But how can I, Yitzhak Rabin, allow the PLO into this process? They're murderers, they're killers, they're terrorists. And he went back and forth. He talked about leadership. The delegation in Washington had a leader, Haider Abdel Shafi, a lawyer from Gaza. On the other hand, Shafi was taking instructions from the PLO, who were not present. And Rabin was caught between this, in the horns of this dilemma, knowing that the only person or the only organization that could take decisions was the PLO, but he had a hard time internally reaching a conclusion to bring the PLO into the process. Now, we know the rest of history, because we walked out of that room, the 5 of us looked at each other and said, he's ready to talk to the PLO. There was no question in our minds that he was ready to talk to the PLO. This is Hamas, by the way. Yeah. We also knew, and it was actually I who knew, that the Oslo Channel had begun, because both the Norwegians and the Israeli academics were using me to transmit what was going on in Oslo to the American government. They would call me, I would then write up the memo, send it to the Secretary of State. So we knew that there was this hybrid process underway in Oslo. It had not yet become formal. Rabin comes in, makes this argument that I can't negotiate with the Palestinians in Washington because they're not authorized. I don't really want to negotiate with Yasser Arafat because I'd rather not see him at all. and he's torn between these two polar opposite views. And of course, a couple of months later, Rabin decided that he would make the process formal. He appointed Uri Savir, who was the Director General of the Israeli Foreign Ministry. He appointed Yoel Zinger, who was the military lawyer for many years in the Judge Advocate General's office in Jerusalem. And then Oslo became formalized in May of 1993. And the rest, you know, by August, they had reached an agreement. In September, they had a signing ceremony in Washington. Rabin's uncertainty about this process was nowhere better shown than in, and I'm sure many of you remember, the White House ceremony, which you probably watched on television, when Clinton spreads his arms and he wants the two of them, Arafat and Rabin, to shake hands. And Arafat's real happy, and Rabin is reluctant. And he finally does, and there's this cheer that goes up. And we thought we had broken the mold and that we were on our way to a peace process. Rabin, as an uncertain and conflicted leader, really is very much a part of his personality. Think of the following. In 1987, in December, the first Intifada broke out. It broke out from a small incident in Gaza, and then it exploded. Rabin was defense minister at that time, was visiting Washington, and some of you may remember the first quote that he made. He said, "I'm going to break their bones." No, it was not soft. You fast forward the clock just a little bit until 1991, just a couple of years later, and Rabin gives a major speech in which he says, "It is imperative for Israel to make peace with the Palestinians and the Arab states, not because peace is such a virtue in and of itself, but because we have a much more dangerous problem lurking over the horizon, Iran." 1991. So Rabin, break their bones, make peace. And this conflict within this leader extended to almost everything he did. Itamar Rabinovich, who wrote probably the definitive biography of Rabin. Rabinovich had been a very prominent academic at Tel Aviv University. His books on the Arab world are required reading. Was appointed as the ambassador of Israel to the United States, and Rabin also appointed him simultaneously to serve as the Israeli representative to the talks with Syria. And so Rabinovich knew Rabin as well as almost anybody could know Rabin. And if you read his book, much of what pervades Rabinovich's analysis is the tension between Rabin and Rabin. The soldier, the advocate for a very tough approach to Israel's adversaries, and the peacemaker, the one who did bring the PLO into the process, the one who, in one of the most extraordinary diplomatic gifts that was ever given to a third party, in August of 1993, at the same time Oslo was reaching fruition, Rabin gave to the United States his bottom line on Syria. Now, he did it for a reason. What he wanted was for the United States to get Assad's bottom line and then to produce an agreement. So Rabin's bottom line was, I'm willing to meet Assad's requirement on territory if Assad is ready to meet my requirements on peace and security. This is called the deposit, or some of the books call it the pocket, because the idea was that Warren Christopher, the Secretary of State, would take that and put it in his pocket, go to Damascus, and get Assad to say the obverse, that I'm willing to meet Rabin's requirements on peace and security if Rabin meets my requirements on territory. Put that in the other pocket, and then at some point, Christopher would take them out of the two pockets, put them together, and say, we have the breakthrough. And the rest becomes important because it's detail, but the conceptual breakthrough would have been achieved. So you had this extraordinary peace process thinker, and you had the soldier. And in a sense, Rabin never bridged the divide as well as one might have thought. And Rabinovich's conclusion, which I don't recall by heart, basically says that at the end, that contributed to an environment in which, not in which he's responsible for his own assassination, but in which Israeli politics became so heated because he was unable and unwilling to figure out how to bridge the divide between the security that was so important to Israelis and remains paramount for Israelis, and the peace that's so important to Israelis and remains paramount for Israelis. And Rabin couldn't figure out how to make that bridge. I tell this story as an introduction to our discussion, and I really want to leave most of our time for your questions and what's on your mind, because this story would be germane and important whenever it would be told from 1995 until today. In fact, just a week or two before his assassination, Rabin gave a speech in the Knesset, some of you know about it, in which he said that he didn't quite believe in a Palestinian state. He talked about state minus. It would be something less than a state. When we were interviewing for one of the books that I've co-authored, and we met with the Israeli negotiating team in Oslo, they said that their biggest regret, their single biggest regret, is that they did not define in Oslo a final status vision. Because if you go to Oslo, it doesn't have a final status. It just says 5 years from the signing, the two parties will reach final status, which left it totally open and undefined. And the negotiators afterwards recognized that this was a huge problem, because once it was undefined, politics gets in the way. In this case, politics and violence, the assassination gets in the way. I remember by the time Rabin was assassinated, I had moved from the peace team to another position in the State Department as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Research. And I was on the phone quite often during that period, especially right after the assassination, with the people that I had worked with when I was working on the problem. And this is going to sound more crass than I mean it, but the argument I made was, you need to exploit the assassination to finish the peace process, because the Israeli public will now understand the need to get to the finish line. And we know, of course, that Shimon Peres wanted his own mandate, and he waited until he could get elected, and of course he wasn't. That's when Netanyahu won the election in May, June of 1996. So you end up then with the question, I don't know if it was in the invitation to today, but I asked the question, the what-ifs following Rabin's assassination. Now, when I teach diplomatic history at Princeton, I try to distinguish between what's called counterfactuals. Those are the what-ifs of history. What happens if the Archduke Ferdinand had not been assassinated? Would World War I have occurred? Now, we all know it would have occurred anyway, but it's a good question to ask. What if he hadn't been assassinated and there hadn't been that immediate crisis that precipitated the immediacy of the war? And you can ask the same what-if question. What if Rabin had not been assassinated? The flip side of counterfactuals are called, one Israeli author coined the term, plausible missed opportunities. Now, most plausible missed opportunities require a very deep understanding of the negotiating process. And at what point in a negotiating process are the conditions ripe enough that a move or failure to move by one party or the other misses the opportunity? Now, what presents an opportunity? It's not just the substance of what's being negotiated. James Baker's book on diplomacy is called The Politics of Diplomacy. Baker understood that you don't conduct diplomacy in a vacuum. You have your own domestic politics, and each party that you're dealing with has its own domestic politics. That also can influence whether a process or an opportunity in a process is missed. There are outside factors, so-called spoilers. You have something that's very positive that's moving forward. Maybe the politics are conducive and there's an act of terrorism. Or what we're seeing today in the West Bank, some extreme settlers on the Israeli side. Terrorists, extreme settlers, terrorist settlers, however you want to call them. So any one of these factors, and there are many of them, that can upset a process that looks like it's going to reach a positive conclusion, and that constitutes what the academics call a plausible missed opportunity. And so I want to conclude by asking the questions of what if and whether we're talking about a plausible missed opportunity. In 1995, were we at a point where Rabin, as leader of Israel, was fated to bring about an outcome of two-state solution? Because technically that was not yet on the table, but it's where everybody knew the process was heading. If you talk to Yasser Arafat after Rabin's assassination, he would say, well, yes, Rabin was my partner. And I think Arafat was, for all of his double dealings, I think he was honest in believing that with Rabin, he could have made a deal. I'm not sure that they could have made a deal, but I think Arafat believed that. I served, as you heard in the introduction, as ambassador of the United States to Egypt. Mubarak had the same view about Rabin. Mubarak respected Rabin in a way that he did not respect any other leader, including in the Arab world. And we had long conversations about the peace process generally and about specifics. And the one thing that he always said about Rabin was, he would tell me if he could do something, and I knew he would do it. And he would tell me if he couldn't do it, explain to me why not, and it was fine. In other words, Mubarak understood that there were going to be things that both sides, but in this case, the Israeli side, Rabin couldn't do, domestic politics or whatever, or maybe ideology. Maybe Rabin didn't want to do some things, and Mubarak respected it. So the counterfactual response of Rabin's assassination is, we probably would have reached a conclusion. And we probably would have reached that conclusion with Syria. Not sure about the Palestinians. In fact, up until 2000, we kept getting very close between Israel and Syria. You remember that Barak asked Clinton to hold a summit meeting in Geneva in, I think it was March or April of 2000. Hafez al-Assad, who was very ill, didn't really want to go, but he believed that he had been assured by Clinton that the bottom line that would be delivered at the summit would be satisfactory. And he went to the summit, and Barak did not deliver a satisfactory bottom line. The summit collapsed, Assad died, and having come close together, they parted ways again. But they never, Israel and Syria have never really been far apart. In fact, if you read, there's a book by Fred Hoff, who negotiated between Israel and Syria in the Obama administration. He believes that had the Syrian civil war not broken out, they would have reached an agreement. So the counterfactual answer to Rabin's assassination probably was there would have been a breakthrough. The emotional or analytical emotional side says the same thing. On the plane back from Madrid, after we had the Madrid Peace Conference, James Baker had a little office at the front of the plane, and we had a little section for the so-called peace team. In the back of the plane were staff and media and so forth. Baker came back to our section of the airplane. And we were all in a good mood. We had just come through this conference, and everybody showed up, and the conference itself was kind of strange, some hard speeches, but we had launched a bilateral process of negotiation and a multilateral process of negotiation. And Baker said to us, this was now November of 91, he said, I will not try to duplicate his Texas twang, but imagine it as I say what he said. He said, you know, I have to go back to the White House soon to run President Bush's reelection campaign. And the president's in trouble. So it's going to be really hard. I'm not going to be able to focus much on what we've been doing here. But he said, if Bush wins, I'm coming back to the State Department and we will start signing peace treaties. And I will tell you, and I'm not exaggerating, that every one of us absolutely believed that that was going to be the case. We figured we had it. We had opened the door. We had a Secretary of State who knew what he was doing. We had a president who backed that Secretary of State fully. Secretary of State was open to incredible amount of pushback and argumentation. We had extraordinary sessions with him. Once he came to trust us, which was not easy, but once he came to trust us, this was not only top down, where the president says, do this, and you go ahead and do it, but we argued over strategy and tactics and process and so forth. And we were persuaded that we had found the key to the door that opened up to a peace process, certainly with Syria and maybe even with the Palestinians. So the counterfactual side of this answer or this question is, I think so. I think we would have had breakthroughs had Rabin not been assassinated. Even though Bush didn't win, even with a weaker foreign policy president and a much weaker Secretary of State, I think we still could have reached a conclusion. On the other question, the plausible missed opportunities, we analyze in the books that I've co-authored, particularly US negotiating style and substance. And we made a lot of mistakes. We really did. I hand out now I'm doing a seminar on diplomacy. I've collected 66 lessons learned. There's no real reason for 66. I'm trying to think of more so I get to some normal number like 75 or whatever. But everything. One of my colleagues in his book said that the United States acted as Israel's lawyer. Now, in the Israel-Palestinian negotiations, you had for the first time in history a people under occupation being asked to negotiate their way out of occupation and into an independent state with their occupier on the other side of the table. It's crazy, absolutely crazy. Unless a third party can act in a way that deals with basic asymmetries. And we never did. Some of us actually thought there were ways to do it. You bend towards Israel on issues related to security, and you bend towards the Palestinians on issues related to territory and governance. So that the Israelis have a sense that the security that they would enjoy after an independent Palestinian state was created was good, probably not perfect, but good enough. The Palestinians would believe that they had a territorially sound, contiguous state in which they exercised most attributes of sovereignty. I say most because there would be limits. They agreed, for example, on a demilitarized state, which is a major limit, but they understood that was the security side of this trade-off. And we didn't do this. We didn't play the role of third party as well as we might have, which suggests that on this second question of plausible missed opportunities, main responsibility with the parties. It's their conflict. Responsibility also on our shoulders. We did not play the game properly. Last point. Questions, answers? Oh, you got to read my books then. You knew I was going to say that. The reason we didn't play the game, and it relates to my last point, we have not had a president, and I'm not sure we have one now, maybe, as Esther suggested at the beginning, who was ready to do the hard work on both sides of this conflict. And that means being as tough on Israel as we have been on the Arab side. During the 2 years of this Gaza war, Joe Biden built up about as much credibility as an American president could build up. $21 billion of assistance, support in the UN Security Council, dispatching national security advisors, Secretary of State, Director of CIA, almost on a regular basis to try to reach a ceasefire hostage deal. And Joe Biden, at the end of the day, was not willing to tell Netanyahu what Trump ultimately told Netanyahu was, the time has come to stop. Now, I leave you with one question mark. As Esther noted, President of the United States has now told Netanyahu to stop. And if you follow the Israeli press, which I'm sure you do, there's a debate as to whether or not Israel has yielded some of its sovereignty to the United States on this critical issue of national security.
U.S. opened the base.
Yeah, right. And when Israel wants to respond to a ceasefire violation, they make a call to Washington first. And Trump has been understanding. You know, if somebody comes out of a tunnel and kills, if Hamas comes out of a tunnel, kills one of your soldiers, yes, you can go back and respond. But Netanyahu, who's under pressure to restart the war, knows that he can't. The question then is, do we have a president who's ready to go beyond the ceasefire and do what still can be done, which is to build a relationship of peace between Israel and the Palestinians? They're not ready to negotiate. It's going to be real hard in a Palestinian population that has been traumatized, and in an Israeli population, which friends of ours tell us is still suffering PTSD 2 years after October 7th. So no one can suggest that this would be easy, but this is really the question that 30 years after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, we're still asking. I guess we're at the question and answer side. Yeah.
Let's call on people.
So Esther, you do the calling on people. I'm done, yeah.
Okay, so we can open it up now for some questions.
It would be great
I
if,
thought the question and answer already started.
The
Okay, we
interjections had already started, yeah.
And then you'll be next.
Okay. So my question is about, you touched on
Tell me who you are first.
Riva Atlas.
Okay.
You touched on early in the conversation, you talked about, you know, again, you said, of course, we could never, ever say that Rabin caused his assassination, but you kind of gave a nod to the fact that, you know, there was obviously this internal dissension.
Rabinovich.
Rabinovich did, but you quoted him, yeah. I'm just curious, because now I remember vividly seeing Rabin on TV after there were all the bus bombings, and he looked so stern, and he kept saying the peace process must go on, and yet, you know, there was the divide in the country that led to his assassination. You know, there's been a theory that only somebody on the right can make peace, and, you know, Ariel Sharon gave back Gaza. I'm curious, you know, as Israel finally heads to an election, I mean, do you think that it needs to be somebody on the right who can move this forward in order to gain the trust of the traumatized Israeli population? Or does it need to be a centrist who is open to dialogue? You know, how would you see this proceeding from here?
You know, as much as I'm always accused of interfering in Israeli domestic politics, I don't have a good answer to that, because only the Israelis are going to be able to sort this out. Analytically, from the outside, I don't buy the idea that only somebody from the right can make this happen. I think it requires leadership, centrist leadership, even left of center leadership, but the leadership that's able to build a domestic coalition around the conditions of peace, and then to see that through against the odds that will be against that leader. I was in my term of office in Israel coincided almost entirely with Sharon's prime ministry. And I watched close up how he lost his coalition. He lost the Likud party, but he was a leader. In fact, Sharon loved to tell stories, and they always had a meaning. So I would sit there waiting for his stories because they explained things that he wasn't saying, kind of outright. One night, about halfway through, he announced the disengagement in December of 2003, and then the disengagement took place in September of 5. So it's, 22 months, 21 months? About halfway through, he had already lost a vote within Likud, and there were all kinds of processes underway that Likud was thinking about kicking him out because the party didn't want disengagement. And so Sharon, one late night, we were having a meeting in Jerusalem, and after we had done our formal business, he says, do you want to hear the story of how the settlements came to be in Gaza? So I said, yeah, I'd like to hear that story. So he tells the story, and he tells it simplistically. Of course, it's much more complicated. He says, when I was the Minister of Agriculture in the late 1970s, I brought a proposal to the cabinet for 3 settlement blocks in Gaza. One between Gaza, Gaza and Egypt, that would act as a tripwire should Egypt ever decide to try to move into Israel that way. One in the middle of Gaza, so as to divide the population and make it harder if the Gazans ever tried to unify against us. And one between the northern, the Ashkelon, Ashdod area and Gaza. He brought this proposal to the cabinet, and the cabinet turned it down. So he said to me, so I went ahead and did it. And if you look at the settlement blocks that were taken down in 2005, there was one here and one there and one there. He just did what he thought he had to do. Now, I'm not advocating, and never would, the illegality of what he did. But what he did was to manifest the leadership that is required, especially in a much more complicated peace process that involves the West Bank and East Jerusalem. If you get that leader, whether it's Yair Golan on the left, or Gadi Eisenkot, center right, or somebody further to the right, doesn't really matter. As long as that person understands that at the end of the day, there has to be a viable Palestinian state living next door to Israel in peace and security, that state has to constitute 22% of historic Palestine, because that's the ultimate sacrifice, quote-unquote sacrifice, the Palestinians say they made. They're only going to get 22% of the land that they think they own, or it belongs to them. It's going to involve Palestinian sovereignty in some part of East Jerusalem, which they're going to call their capital. It's going to be hard for any Israeli leader to do that, but if you get a leader who understands that that's the outcome that has to be, he has to work it. Now, we had one, Ehud Olmert. Whether you like him or don't like him, if you look at what he did in 2008 with Mahmoud Abbas, this was all laid out, including a proposal on East Jerusalem that didn't specify Palestinian sovereignty in the old city. It talked about a model of it wasn't called shared sovereignty, it was deferred sovereignty with some international board of governors or whatever. Study that actually I participated in with the Canadians on what's called the Jerusalem Old City Initiative. Very creative study. But Olmert was ready to do essentially 100% of what was required. He just didn't have a partner on the other side, literally, because Mahmoud Abbas walked away at that time. Olmert was about to be indicted, and Abbas said, why would I make an agreement with a prime minister who's not going to be in office very long? It's not an unwise decision. But we lost it at that point. We came very close.
Thank you.
This is so people on Zoom can hear. So.
Sure. Hi, I'm David Weiser, and I'm interested in what happened that Israel never made a peace treaty with Syria. What did the especially what did the U.S. not do, and what did they do? Because I hear there were rumors that they actually told the Israelis not to. Susan Rice.
Yeah, I don't know if I haven't heard that rumor, frankly, and if there is such a rumor, I can't tell you if it's true or not. There were two moments when they were close enough to think that they could have reached an agreement. One was at the summit meeting between Clinton and Assad in March of 2000. They had private, secret negotiations at Bowling Air Force Base. Okay. They had negotiations at Bowling Air Force Base in Washington, and then at Blair House, and then you remember in January of 2000, they went to Shepherdstown, West Virginia, and at that point, the Israelis and Americans thought that the Syrian Foreign Minister, Farouk Ashara, had given them the last concession that was needed from the Syrians with respect to a foothold on Yam Kinneret, on the Sea of Galilee. Assad had always demanded that he have a foothold on the shore. He said when he was a kid, he used to have his feet in the water. Israel was nervous about that because of the possibility of what do you do if they pollute the water in a negative way. Israel also referred to a 1923, I think it is, treaty that said that the border between Syria and the mandated territory of Palestine would be 10 meters off the shore of the sea. So that was the Israeli position. But at Shepherdstown, the Americans and Israelis thought that the Syrians had kind of given that up. And that's why Barak wanted the summit meeting. But then Barak got cold feet, and Clinton did not hold those cold feet to the fire. In fact, the craziest part of that summit is that Clinton told Barak that he wanted Barak to send him the Israeli position, which he would then deliver to Assad. Assad believing he was going to get what he needed. Clinton didn't get the Barak talking points until literally just before the summit, at which point, I was not on the peace team at the point, but it's in various books, at which point Clinton's advisors said, don't hold this meeting because what Barak sent you is not sufficient. And Clinton said, no, I'm going to deliver the talking points, and he did. And I think it took 7 minutes or 8 minutes for Assad to say, this is not it. The summit went on for another hour or two, but it effectively ended after about 7 or 8 minutes. But they were that close. And when I say that close, it wasn't the question of language in a talking point. It was a conceptual gap that Barak was not ready to bridge. That was one point. And then the other was, as I mentioned, up until the Syrian civil war in 2011, when Fred Hoff was negotiating in the Obama administration, the interesting part of that negotiation was he changed the paradigm. Up until then, the paradigm had been what I talked about, Rabin's the pocket thing, where you give me what I need and he gives me what he needs and we'll figure it out. Hoff changed the paradigm in a very interesting way and talked about the regional implications for both Syria and Israel of reaching an agreement. And it started working, and then the Syrian civil war broke out and it ended. Would it have ended in an agreement? We don't know. But it was a very interesting, different way of approaching the issue that in a sense, got cut short by the Syrian civil war. Hoff is actually angry at Obama because he wanted to go to Syria right after the first violence that took place in southern Syria, in Deraa. He thought that he could get to Assad, to the son, Bashar Assad, and maybe change his mind about clamping down on the demonstrators. Not sure he could have. Syria is a tough place, as most of you know. And I had an argument with, Fred's a good friend. He's also a Yankee fan, so we're really good friends. I had an argument with him because I pointed out that at the beginning of the civil war in Syria, it's pretty clear that Assad's mother, Hafiz's wife, said to Bashar, her son, when we took over this country in 1970, there were 7 million Syrians, and now there are 20, and if we have to maintain control by returning to 7 million, and if it takes 13 million deaths, we can do it. Is that true? I don't know, but it sounds true, okay? And the way they acted, probably 1 million people were killed in the Syrian civil war.
Maybe America should.
Hold on 1 second. So there were 2 moments when we were potentially very close, and I'm not sure we acted as strongly. Clinton, for example, should not have delivered Barack's talking points. He should have told Assad to wait in the hotel, gotten on the phone with Barack to say, you and I have a crisis. Unless you give me the right talking points, I'm calling this off and I'm going to announce that you haven't given me what you promised to give me, that kind of thing. He's very anxious to ask.
Very anxious. Here you go.
No, we have a difference of opinion about.
What's your name?
Aryeh,
Aryeh.
Schonbrunn.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, I'm not gonna. So I just wanted to get your opinion on. Do you think that Rabin was motivated by a fear of diplomatic isolation, just going, based on what happened with South Africa, basically simultaneously? Was that sort of part of the calculation to sort of shield Israel from the onslaught of Western disagreement, or sort of?
I'll answer you, but the one-word answer is no. I don't think it motivated him at all. I'm a believer that he was motivated by a strategic sense of where the potential existential danger to Israel lay, and that was in Iran. He understood it early in the 1990s, gave this speech, and then acted accordingly to the speech and we heard him talk about it, that the Arab-Israel crisis for him was a burden on Israel. It wasn't any longer an existential issue for Israel. Israel was so strong even then, and it's gotten even stronger relative to its neighbors, that it wasn't a strategic problem. The strategic problem was for Rabin, if I have to worry about periodic wars with this Arab party and that Arab party, Hamas had already come into existence in the first Intifada. Who knew what was going to happen elsewhere? There was still no Jordan-Israel treaty, and Jordan, remember, had a civil war in 1970 with Palestinians. And he was looking at Iran. So I don't think South Africa and the concerns about being ostracized internationally, did he ever articulate it? I can't say no, but I never heard it from him, and none of the people around him ever suggested that that was even part of the discussion. Wait. Esther's in charge.
Thank you. My name is Alexander. You mentioned the conflict in Yitzhak Rabin himself between the need for security and the awareness that something serious is needed there, and the desire to make peace. And you clearly outlined the conflict in himself. What do you think is needed in Israeli society today, knowing that the same conflict exists there?
At the risk of repeating, you need a leader who understands this and who's ready to do the hard work of pushing the society in the right direction. If you want to be led by Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, Netanyahu's doing a good job of it. They are leading him rather than his leading them. Who's in control? Who's the Ariel Sharon type leader who can say, I've defined the vision, I have a method of getting there, and I'm going to go ahead and do it. Now, I say this knowing also that Sharon made some extremely extreme mistakes in the run-up to the disengagement. He didn't prepare properly either for the handoff to the Palestinians. We pressed him very, very hard all the time, and he did not want to talk to the Palestinian Authority about disengagement because he thought that they were going to expand their demands. Oh, you're ready to give us Gaza? Thank you. We're going to put that in our pocket. And now what we want is X, Y, or Z. So he didn't want to talk to them about that. And only very late in the game did he start talking to them about the mechanics of the greenhouses and the other kinds of things that needed to be handed over. So we're not talking about, Mr. Perfect. And Sharon, of course, was a major supporter of settlement activity, which has always beset this peace process in very negative ways. But even Sharon in 2004, in order to get from George W. Bush a kind of general commitment of support, was willing to promise to take down 101 illegal outposts, the Machazim. Now, he didn't take them down at the end of the day. So we're not talking about, again, Mr. Perfect, but it was a leader who brought back this, it's a letter, you can Google it. It's the Bush letter to Sharon and the Dov Weissglass letter to Condoleezza Rice. It's the package. He was ready to bring home, not only am I going to withdraw from Gaza, but I'm going to take down 101 Machazim. It takes something for a leader to do that. This is domestic politics at its most significant manifestation. Now, it's harder today, no question about it. You have, even during the Gaza war, I forget the number, but I think they built something like another 120 illegal outposts during the war. And the army and settlers killed almost 1,000 Palestinians in the West Bank. Nobody's paying attention to it because everybody's watching what's going on in Gaza. So it's much harder today, but a leader is a leader. Trump, in his own way, is that kind of leader, but I don't think he has the patience to see it through. He's mercurial. So he's ready to say, as he did yesterday, if Nigeria doesn't stop killing Christians, I'm going to beat them to hell, okay? And tomorrow he's going to have some threat against Venezuela. And the next day it'll be against Colombia. And then he'll want a meeting with Kim Jong-un. So he's peripatetic in this respect. And that is not, that will undermine that leadership that's required to be sustained, backbone, determined. And I don't know if I hope we have it. And I'm certainly not a fan of Trump, but I will applaud if I'm wrong, if he in fact does the right thing.